Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jenn, your host today, and I'm here with the author of an extraordinarily fun and thrilling and unput-downable thriller. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, so my name is Maria Dong. That's D-O-N-G, just like the sound a bell makes. And my book is called Liar, Dreamer, Thief. It's been shelved as a thriller. I think it kind of combines a lot of different genres together, so people argue quite a bit about where it actually sits. But it's basically the story of a young Korean American woman who has some mental illness problems. And she is a little too invested in a coworker and kind of, I would say, semi-stalking this person. And then during the course of her investigations, he does something, really terrible. And she's really shocked that this happened. But he also tells her it's all her fault. And so for the rest of the book, she's trying to figure out like what that means. And then as it goes on, she kind of discovers that actually she's much more tied up into all of this than she realized, and that he was probably watching her the whole time as well.
I just loved it so much. It's so much fun, and I do agree that there are thriller type elements, but it is sort of you could also make really, I think, solid arguments for a couple of other genres as well. Is that something that you strove for as you were writing, or did it just sort of happen to, do this as you were telling the story that you meant to tell?
That's such a funny question. I actually tried to do the exact opposite. So I'm a science fiction fantasy writer for the most part. I've had a number of pieces published in big magazines like Lightspeed and Nightmare. I actually just had a piece that was published in the best science fiction and fantasy of the year, like the big, compendium that goes around. Mm-hmm. And so, but I had gone in submission a couple of times with my agent with these various science fiction fantasy books, but the pandemic had happened and that had really changed kind of like the market and what publishers were looking for, what they were open to. And my books are kind of like off the wall generally. If you read this one, then you will know that it's kind of hard to easily slot into things. And so at one point my agent was just like, hey, why don't you try writing something that's not science fiction or fantasy? It's a bigger market, I've got a lot of connections. We'll see what we can do. And so I said, okay, I'm going to write like the most bog standard mystery possible, right? So I read 50, 60 books, all back to back to back to back, and made notes. And then I read all these books about how to write a mystery. And then I sat down and I started drafting it, and I could not get through it. I was so I don't know if it was, I was bored or if I hadn't really found the core of what was going on. But it was just suffering for 60,000 words. So 8 months, it took me 8 months to just draft the most bare bones first half of this book. And then I wrote the first kitchen door scene. I think I was just so frustrated and refusing to pay attention to what I was doing. And I just started writing something randomly. And it really spoke to me. And I realized oh, this is a big engine of this book. And the kitchen door scene's kind of a speculative element. So then I had to go back and weave that in from the very beginning, which meant I had to start the whole book over again because it was this completely different book. And there's a scene that I call the dumpster scene, which is pretty funny. And up until that point, I had tried really hard to write this dark and twisty, thrilling mystery, and it wasn't working. I was clearly trying too hard. And then I wrote this really ridiculous, really slapdash scene, and I realized oh no, this is also part of it. This character is actually this very messy person, right? So then I had to go back to the beginning, and I think with those two pieces, I was able to kind of figure out how everything fit together. So absolutely not, I did not try to do this. And in fact, when we sold it, I thought I was going to call it a semi-cozy mystery or something. And then the publisher was like, this is a psychological suspense. And I was like, is it is that a genre? I wasn't sure. And they were like, that's where we're going to call it. So you should probably know that. And I was like, oh, thank you so much for that information. Cause I really didn't know. And it's hard to see cause you're so close to it. Right. So, yep.
That's so interesting to me because I always think of genre as it kind of functions in two ways. It can either be a category that your work is slotted into in order to let readers know what it is going to be, and how to search for books and stuff like that. But then there's also the other side where like genre is kind of like a buffet, where you can like pick and choose elements and sort of like make your own thing out of them. And I think it's really interesting to think about just the ways in which like writers' sense of genre collides with like the publishing world's sense of genre. Yeah.
Definitely there's a difference between like the artistic concept of genre and what writers are thinking about when they're creating stories, and then like the commercial side of genre that publishers are thinking about when they're trying to pitch and sell books, particularly to readers. And it makes it very complicated because I do a fair amount of mentoring now of like people who are just they're good writers that are just now getting into like the publishing side of things. Especially people who are like marginalized. It's like a big passion of mine. And it's very interesting having these conversations because I'm like, yes, I know that this is a romance, but like we can't sell this as a romance because of X, Y, and Z. So we have to kind of like pitch it this way. And it's such an arcane and obscure set of knowledge that like I very quickly get out of my depth because I'm not an agent, I'm not a publisher, I'm just a writer who had this like one path. And so like these publishing category distinctions, I don't even understand all that well. I just sent a book to my agent and she was like, boy, all right, I will think about what to call this. You know what I mean? So it's very much like it's kind of, there is a right answer, but there really isn't a right answer, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It's really tricky. I think about like, when I have written things in the past, like I've done a little fiction writing, and also I was in academia before I fell into library. So I did like scholarly writing, and it's really interesting, like some people write their story and then later come up with the elevator pitch, but then there's also like the reverse way of like you have the cool idea or like the high concept pitch, and then you build out like a story from there. Have you written both ways, or do you tend to write in one way or the other? Or
I've written about 20 books at this point, over 20 books. I actually did a TikTok where I was trying to like list all the books to show people like it actually takes quite a long time, a lot of times, to get to the point of publication, because a lot of people send their book out there, and if they don't get an agent right away or they don't get an editor right away, they kind of give up, or they feel really disheartened, when actually that would not be a very normal course. Like I think the majority of people write several books, they go out and submission a couple times, it takes a long time. So I tried to do like a TikTok where I was like, here's the books I wrote to get here. And it wound up being like a 6-part series because it kept running out of time as I was like listing all these different pieces. So I've done like all of the different things. What I have found, and a part of this is because of how long I think I've been doing this, that like it's very important that I stay interested in the book. And if I plot everything out to like a T before I write the book, I have like zero interest in figuring out where the book's going to go or what happens. So I can't do that anymore, even though it's like really time consuming and like very inefficient to just like blindly draft something off of nothing more than like vibes. That's kind of how I have to approach this so that I can stay interested, particularly because like when you write a book, you don't just write the book, you edit the book like 6 or 7 times, and then you send it to your agent, you edit it again, and then it goes to an editor and you edit it again and again and again. So like if I knew everything that was going to happen and then I had to read that book 30 times, I probably would have just given up. Like I would just give up. I don't have stamina as a person. Like I just don't.
that makes total sense to me. Yeah, because you have to maintain your own investment in a work while you're writing it, or it won't get written. So that makes total sense to me. Could we talk a little bit about Katrina? Because this book has such a fascinating main character, and her perspective is unlike anything I've really encountered before. She's an unreliable narrator, but like in some very interesting ways that I haven't encountered before. So could you tell me a little bit about like where she comes from, and especially where her, I think, worldview or how she perceives the world, because she has a really rich sort of like fantasy life as well, can you talk about her a little bit?
I would love to. And thank you so much for this question. It's such a fun question. I think that, first of all, I think it's very interesting when people call her an unreliable narrator, because she is telling the truth about her experience at all times.
That's
so
true.
yeah, a lot of times, especially in thriller, like when we talk about unreliable narrators, it's usually like, and they were actually the villain all along or something. And so there's this idea that the narrator is holding something away from you at all times, right? And she's very much not doing that. She's being very honest about the things that she's experiencing and seeing. The question is what she's seeing and experiencing real to an outsider or to an outside objective person? And I think that a lot of this comes from my own experience with mental illness. And I think when you have mental illness, depending on, the different features or whatever, one of the things that's like very common is you start to understand that the reality that you are experiencing, whether that's like your emotional reality or like your physical, like the reality that you see and experience, is not necessarily the same reality that everyone else is experiencing. And this is actually true of everyone, I think, but mental illness makes it very obvious to you, right? Because you're saying one thing, your therapist is telling you that's not true, something else. You've got, doctors telling you something else. You've got your family telling you something else. And these narratives don't all agree. And so I think that like one of the things I was really trying to do with this book was to explain things in such a way that you would feel as a reader the way it feels to live through that experience. And part of that is that a lot of things you don't actually get to know fully what is 100% real, right? And I think that some people really love that. They're like, oh, this is very unique and interesting. I've never seen this. Some people really hate it because they want that nice, safe, box of like, this is what's real, this is what's not real, at least by the end. And I think one commonality I've noticed when people give that feedback is that people who have experiences where they are used to kind of seeing things in a different way than maybe would be like the norm or the typical. So like people who have mental illness or are neurodivergent, people who are like between cultures, they tend to be more open to this like weird book where nothing quite is maybe what it seems. And then people who aren't used to that and are used to there just being this very clear objective truth that they can like knock on it, feel it, smell it, hear it, see it, they really don't like this idea that like maybe something isn't exactly the way it looks. You know what I mean? So
oh wow, I love all of that. That's so interesting. And you're absolutely right that like, yes, like when you have experiences with mental illness, you're almost in a way um aware of your own status as potentially as an unreliable narrator to
yeah,
yourself,
yeah,
and so you develop this like real meta awareness of your thoughts and how, a kind of distance you develop from them, and that's super interesting. And yeah, like her coping mechanism actually does seem to be like, I'm going to be the most reliable narrator, tell you everything that I experience, and
yeah,
then, yeah, like we'll sort it out, like but
yeah.
I really love her perspective, and I love the kitchen door world. Could we talk
Oh,
a bit about that too?
yeah. I mean, like I said, I hadn't anticipated that even being in the book, right? And the first time that I wrote one of the scenes where she's stepping through this, like, and it's very, I think in many ways I was surprised by how much people loved it because it almost, to me, writing it almost felt like a little bit too typical. Like there's tons and tons and tons of children's books, right? Where you open a door in your house and you walk through and like there's another world, right? It's very Lion the Witch in the Wardrobe. And like I can think of just like dozens and dozens of books across cultures, right? But I think that's also part of what attracts people to it because we've all kind of read that book and imagined ourselves living that world and being able to take advantage of that circumstance. So I think that the reaction to it like was a little bit surprising, but then later I was like, oh, that kind of makes sense. But as it was initially written, it wasn't as cohesive of a world. So there were like these little things happening, like the dragonflies in the kitchen and things like that, but they weren't all like one-to-one correlated with this like story that she has in this storybook when she's a child. And I think maybe I was shying away from that because I was not supposed to be writing a fantasy novel. So like, I was being extra, extra careful. And my editor was like, this absolutely, like, I would love for you to link these together. And, she was totally right because I think that has appealed to so many people. And, your own book, you're too close to it, right? So it's hard to see like, oh yeah, that would be a great connection. But I could tell like, as I started to go through that process and like the lore of the world started to get a little bit deeper, and it's never too deep because again, it's not a fantasy novel. So I can't go full bore into that like I would like to. It started to feel more cohesive and more reflective of like Katrina's personality and her history and the things that she kind of wants and wishes from the world, like we all have, I mean, I'm assuming, I don't know, I'm not in someone else's head. And see, that's that whole mental illness, like I can't know reality thing. But like my assumption is that we all have these really deep desires for our lives and things that we need and want and dream about and pine for. And so like she's just got this very physical representation of that in some ways.
Yeah, and I think it really speaks so much to the ways in which literature, especially children's literature, can be so important to
Yeah.
children who are experiencing instability of any kind,
Yeah.
and how those connections don't really go away. And how almost like those deep relationships that we have with our childhood texts can almost like come to haunt us in a way while also
Mm-hmm.
keeping us, like I just really love that sort of ambiguity there about like escaping into a fantasy world is super comforting, and it's like survival for a lot of people, especially for children. But then on the other hand, it's like, yes, a slippery slope, and also presents some dangers. And like it's a real, like, but like any good fantasy world, I guess, right? Like
Yeah, well, and the fantasy worlds of children sometimes are particularly horrifying or terrifying. When I think about like, when I was a kid, I read all of like the Oz books. There's like, I don't know, there's like a bazillion of them, right? And I just, I love them, I consume them, whatever. Now as an adult, I go back and I look at those books and I'm like, this is horrifying. Like on many levels. Like the creatures that they're encountering and the peril that they're in is really scary. But then also the ways that these books reflect certain, maybe, I don't know how to say this, but like social mores that the writers of the book might have, that like now reading them now I'm like kind of horrified by. So there's all these different levels on which like children's literature can actually be quite scary. So I think that was related to what you were talking about. I'm sorry, I like distracted myself. So
no, that totally makes sense. Yeah, I oh gosh, it's just so interesting to me. And I love the way that you know that the kitchen door world interacts with the like quote unquote real world,
Yeah.
and like it's really interesting to me how they're like in communication or in dialogue, because obviously like her deep familiarity with the story and the lore is shaping how she perceives like moving through the everyday world. But then also like it's the same thing is happening in the other direction, like it's a really like that kind of externalized fantasy world really does become like a really cool way to explore like a character's inner landscape.
Yeah. I think that too, I wrote an essay about this for, I think, Crime Reads, but one of the things that was really important to me here as a person who has, lived with mental illness, but then also several marginalities. And like one of the things that happens when you're, living in a marginalized body or with a marginalized identity is that in the popular culture tends to tell you that your experiences aren't true or valid. Or, even like the most objective, quote unquote, scientific data has a bunch of bias in it that causes it to maybe not accurately be able to capture like your experiences or your reality. So we have this kind of culture which sees like, like data and numbers as like the primacy end all be all of like everything possible, and often discounts like these big pieces of human experience, particularly of those people who aren't like the, top level hegemonic structure. You know what I'm trying to say here? I'm like losing my words because I don't talk while I write. I don't speak. And so like, I think that it was really important for me to have this like detective essentially who isn't like this like incredibly logical, like somehow a super genius, like, is like looking at things and like pinpointing angles and like decides like, okay, like, first this happened, then this happened. Because I think particularly like in detective fiction and mystery fiction, it kind of upholds this value of like the only thing that matters is this like I don't know, this like mathematical analysis almost, if that makes sense. And it kind of discounts like the deeply human pieces of that experience or like that the mystery genre can give us, I guess. I'm like all over the place. I'm so sorry. So I just really wanted to create a narrator whose way of moving through the world isn't perfectly logical, but also is logical to her. Like it makes sense to her. If you see her, you can understand how this is woven into like the very fundamental aspects of her character, all the way down and all the way up. But at the same time, like she's making lots of terrible decisions, which when people point that out to me, I'm always like, I made a lot of terrible decisions in my 20s, so I can't say anything, like honestly. But it makes sense within the context of like who she is, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. That does lead me to another interesting question too, because I think that like something I notice like when I read this doesn't have to do with your book in particular, but just sort of like books in general, about how when a book has like a marginalized protagonist, there becomes a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure on that character to like be perfect in a way, and I think that is a problem with like the lack of representation, like because if there were more marginalized characters, it wouldn't hinge on one character to represent every single experience. And is that something that is like on your mind when you are crafting characters like this, especially when they can be perceived as like flawed or complicated or wrong?
Yeah, I think that like in the last like 5 to 10 years, no, it's got to be like 10 years now, because again, I wrote this book like 3 years ago, right? So there's like this delayed time phase thing that happens with publishing. But in the last like decade, obviously the conversations in the writing and publishing sphere around representation have kind of become more sophisticated. And so I've been more aware and been thinking about this a lot more. I was very confident in writing this character because so much of her experience reflected my own. And after like my whole lifetime of being told that my experiences like aren't valid or aren't important, whatever, I kind of was in this place where I was like, screw it, I'm going to write myself. And, if you don't like that, if you have a problem with that, if you think the representation of the mental illness here isn't accurate, like it's me, it's my experience. So like, I felt very comfortable and confident in that. When there are aspects of different identities that I do write that I treat with a lot more, I wouldn't say care, because I was careful in her representation. Like I tried very hard to be truthful, but like, with more, I'm just very diligent about kind of making sure that the representation isn't harmful as much as you can, as much as possible. And see, I already lost the question. But I think, right, in context of like more representation, kind of allowing for a greater kind of representation, I don't think that's automatic. And what I mean by that is, for example, East Asian narratives, which, I'm an East Asian person, I wrote an East Asian person book, are not like disproportionately low compared to like the percentage of East Asians in the population. So if you look at like how many books feature Asian protagonists, and then you look at how many Asian people are in the United States, like East Asians, sorry, they're not disproportionate. But the kind of representation that East Asian individuals have in books tends to be very like stereotypical, right? Like publishing is really interested in like a certain number of like very specific narratives, like the Tiger Mom narrative, like the Flowers and Fire Asian fantasy narrative. Now there's this like kind of crazy rich Asians. So like there's a lot of books coming out with that kind of like feel to it. And if you're writing things about Asian Americans that don't fit into those like specific narrative places, it can be very difficult. One of the books that I went on sub with was actually a science fiction book that was, looking at capitalism, and particularly through like I would say like an East Asian context more than an American context. Like one thing that people don't realize about South Korea, for example, is it's very hyper-capitalist, but it's a different kind of maybe capitalism than we're completely used to in the United States. And when we were on sub with it, some of the places that we sent it to had previously read a like epic historical Korean inspired fantasy that I had written. And they said like, oh, well, this is a change. And like, can't Maria write some more like Korean books? So like this idea that both books could be Korean didn't occur to them because they were only interested in like very specific kinds of narrative. So I agree with you that we need to see more representation, period, point blank. And that would allow more space for like different kinds of narratives. Like, this is an example of a messy mental health Asian American like immigrant child, but also vegan. Like there's a lot of pieces to this representation, but it's not automatic. Like we still, as a culture of like publishing, have to say, okay, we also want to uplift or like at least publish some books that don't necessarily line up with like these stereotypes, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it's really important that's at work here. And I think the same could be said for the representation of mental illness too, because I think a lot of times like people or publishers maybe are interested in depictions of mental illness that like fit a particular portrait, that are like, easy to contain and like maybe passive and like somehow aesthetically pleasing. Like, we love like willowy, like,
manic pixie dream girl, or like, the what do you call it, like the fainting debutante who's also really sad. Like, I think it's really interesting. Like, so obviously this character has obsessions and compulsions. I don't necessarily want to say that she has obsessive compulsive disorder, because there are many mental illness like constellations that can cause obsessions and compulsions, particularly when a person's like in a moment of crisis, right? Like it's all kind of on a spectrum. So, and I'm very cautious when it comes to like diagnosing fictional characters generally, because like we're only getting such a small slice of their life, and she at this point has not received that diagnosis anywhere from anybody. So like, and even at the end of the book, which you haven't fully never mind. And the end of the book, there's also like a mention of the fact that like she's having a conversation with a therapist, and the therapist essentially says that like diagnosis itself is for insurance companies and research, and that is the case, right? So these diagnoses that we've developed, they're all like DSM-5 diagnoses, and the primary purpose of them was so that we could research diagnoses, and we had to be able to categorize in order to do that research. And then now also to be able to enact treatment through an insurer. If you don't have to deal with insurance, you don't actually have to create a diagnosis. You can treat someone based on their symptoms and, do like experimentation with them on like what helps them or what works for them. But we don't live in that kind of healthcare system right now. So I was very careful about like not diagnosing her. And I was very emphatic, like, anything that's written about the book from my publisher, back cover copy, any kind of like flyers that went out, like it was really important. They didn't specifically say like obsessive compulsive disorder. So she has obsessions and she has compulsions, and they're very much written from the perspective of someone who has dealt with that. And they specifically deal with how things feel, because so much of the like media coverage of obsessive compulsive disorder, like whether it's books or movies, is just this constant narrative of like, I have to clean things and, turn on and off my gas burner. And it's very much about like how this affects other people, or maybe like how this looks from the outside, but it doesn't usually, I think, really get into like how things feel, probably because it's harder to convey that. And also because if you don't know what that feels like, it could be difficult to write about that. So it's safer not to. And I think like out of all of the compliment, because you get compliments when you publish a book and it's great and you're like really happy for like a day, and then you go back to being like a sad writer. But out of all the compliments that I've gotten several people that have said like, I have obsessive compulsive disorder, I have obsessions, I have compulsions, and this is the first time I've read something that like so accurately represented that. And that really felt amazing to read that, because I felt like I would have liked to have that like growing up, and so it's like really nice to see that being provided. So I'm getting like all weird and teary. So
That's wonderful. Yeah, that is like really powerful. And I think you're absolutely right about like how diagnoses function and what they do. And I think, oh gosh, yeah, I just think it's just really lovely that it's allowed to be messy and just be what the experience is, because I think that like on my own journey, like you get a lot of diagnoses on the way to I don't even want to say your final diagnoses, because it might not be like, you don't know what lies ahead, so but like the different labels that you apply to it don't really change your experience of it. And so I think it is really powerful that it is about the experience and not about like putting labels on it. And it was instructive for me to read it too, because even with this experience, as I was reading it, I was like, oh, is this OCD? Is this or this, that? And it really, it encouraged me to like interrogate my need to do that, and that was really,
it's uncomfortable. It's so uncomfortable. People are very uncomfortable with it. I sometimes am uncomfortable with it. I mean, but also the experience of being a person who's early in that diagnostic process is uncomfortable. So I think a lot of times people's discomfort actually mirrors the discomfort that she's already feeling. Maybe it may not be for the exact same reason, but you can't make someone uncomfortable for the same reason as the character. Like we all have different experiences. So like the closest I could come was making them uncomfortable about something else. Like if the reality of the book is correct, or if this diagnosis is there or is going to be there or not. Right. And that in a way mirrors the discomfort that you feel when you're going through, like you were saying, that path to the quote unquote final diagnosis. And I think it's so funny that you said that, because when we sent this book, so we sent this book to the publisher and they were like, yeah, we want to publish it. And they bought it. We went through the process and everything. And then like a year before it comes out, I get a new diagnosis, which is ADHD. Right. And I had like never even considered that I might have ADHD, because like, I think that, particularly diagnosing AFAB people has like ramped up a lot, because when I was young, like young girls basically did not get diagnosed with ADHD. That was just not a thing that happened. They had like bipolar disorder or something, right? You could have the same exact symptoms, but like they would go into a different diagnosis box. And I thought that was really interesting, because like all of my like symptoms of like quote unquote bipolar were only happening like when I had to do certain tasks, which is not usually how that's supposed to work. But that was kind of like the diagnostic box that I had. And then like I had someone else tell me like years later, like, you obviously don't have bipolar. You've never had a manic episode. You never had like a hypomanic episode, as far as we can tell. You just get really excited by certain things and you're very distractible. So like, what is that? So, so I get diagnosed with like this, I get diagnosed with that, and like years and years go by. And then finally I write a book about my experiences. And then as that book is getting published, they're like, actually, you have ADHD. And to be honest, I believe it. Part of the reason I believe it is a lot of people have like kind of like come together and agreed on that at this point. So I'm like, okay, maybe like the consensus of the masses here. But then I read this book and I'm like, oh man, she's got it too. And I never would have realized that, right? But then you're looking at like the state of her house and her, like her decision-making process and her impulsivity and like how much trouble it gets her in and how bad she feels about it, but how she's not really in a place where she can just like willpower her way into behaving like quote unquote better. Like those are all key features of ADHD. And like I had no idea and I just like wrote it right into this book. So definitely what you were talking about as far as like the path to quote unquote final diagnosis, like whew, that hit real hard.
Oh gosh, that's yeah. And it speaks to the point you made previously too about how like we put a lot of faith in like numbers and logic and science,
Yeah.
and like that itself is culturally conditioned, and we are used to like giving certain diagnoses to certain people, and
Yeah.
like I think that's all like something that the book makes you think about a lot too.
Yeah.
Do you plan on returning to this, like, we've completely interrogated the concept of genre, but like do you plan to return to this type of story?
Like you mean like a thriller or suspense, that kind of thing?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I have some irons in the fire. I'm sure you know that with publishing, you're not allowed to talk about things until you're allowed to talk about them. So I can't really talk about any of them, but I definitely like am hoping for kind of like a bifurcated career where on one hand I'm writing more, I'll call it like suspense with speculative pieces. And then I'd also like to continue writing like actual speculative fiction, like science fiction fantasy. So I'm not really sure if that's doable, if it's like a viable career path, whatever. But like this is something that I'm doing mostly for myself. I have a day job. So like I have a little more flexibility in terms of just like kind of shooting for the fences that way. And I'm like pretty hopeful. So
Nice. Well, yeah, I'm very excited to read those books, and I'm so glad that you came to our show to talk about this one. I really can't wait to recommend it to our patrons and
oh,
get it out there.
thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Okay, listeners, you should pick up Liar, Dreamer, Thief at your favorite bookstore or library, wherever you get your books. It'll be available by the time that you listen to this, so I absolutely recommend you go get it. Thanks for joining us, and it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.